Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third in our series of seminars titled Breaking Boundaries, a Disabled Postgraduate's PhD Journey. And this seminar series has been arranged by a group and a coming together, if you like, of different departments and staff and students within the college to raise awareness of the barriers that disabled postgraduates face in engaging with postgraduate studies. But also, of course, it's to focus on the skills that can be developed and the strategies for success disabled people have used during this time. My name, of course, is Vivian Rath, and I am the chair or the convener of the Forum for Disabled Staff and Postgraduate Students here in Trinity College, Dublin. And of course, you are all very welcome. This series has been organised by our forum here in the college, the GSU Disability Rights Officer, the Trinity Ability Co-op and the Trinity Disability Service, and has been kindly sponsored by the Postgraduate Office and the Postgraduate and Wellbeing Fund here in the university. However, of course, a large portion of the work is done by volunteers here. This session today, our third session, as I mentioned, called Addison's Barter's Academia and Me, with the brilliant Dr. Fiona Smith. I happen to know Fiona very well because Fiona has been a member of our forum here in the college since its very beginning. Fiona is an interdisciplinary scholar in science and society in the School of Education and lectures at the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities. Her expertise lies at the interface of the history of architecture and the history of science, with a central focus on acoustics. I have been really looking forward to hearing this talk today because although Fiona and I work together in the Trinity Centre for People with Intellectual Disabilities, and we also work together on the forum, we often don't get to share these stories and share these experiences. And really, that's what these seminars are about. It's about sharing those experiences of the challenges and also the successes associated with undertaking postgraduate study, and to identify postgraduate study as a viable option and pathway for disabled people progressing from their masters or undergraduates, from undergraduate into a master's, into perhaps maybe PhD and on into academia. Of course, many people go into other pathways as well, such as maybe into employment. But the key is that, and the reality is that many disabled people face barriers to engaging in postgraduate studies. And we know that because the figures for the proportion of disabled people in postgraduate studies are quite low in comparison to other areas like undergraduate study. But anyhow, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Fiona Smith to speak to us today about her talk titled Addison's Barter's Academia and Me. Fiona, take the stage.
Thank you very much, Viv. And hello, everybody. It is really lovely to see you here. And thank you all for being here. And thank you also to Sarah, Viv, Patricia, and Courtney for asking me to speak about my PhD journey. I think this is probably the first time I've ever spoken about the overall arc of that journey. And when I told my brother that I was giving this talk, he said, "Oh my, there are going to be a few stories in that one." Well, actually, he said something a little bit more pointed and emphatic than "oh my," but I'm not sure if I could actually use those words on Zoom. So I'm paraphrasing. And don't worry, I'm not going to even try to get through all of the stories. I'm just going to pick out some that hopefully might be useful or encouraging to somebody else. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about before the PhD too. I think it's important to do that and to talk about what led up to the PhD, because if somebody is thinking of doing a PhD, it's important, and it's reassuring also to know that some of the difficulties and the challenges that are encountered as an undergraduate aren't necessarily there as a postgraduate, or at least not necessarily there in the same way or to the same extent. Because one of the beauties of doing a PhD is that you have the flexibility to find your feet and to find your pace in a way that is difficult in the more structured context of an undergraduate course. There are certainly challenges to the PhD journey. I won't pretend there aren't. But maybe undertaking a PhD can often be a lot more doable than you might think or expect. So my talk today is entitled Addison's, Barter's, Academia and Me. And I decided to be quite blunt in that title for a number of reasons. One is because this is a talk about navigating academia with an invisible disability. So I've decided to call it out in all its invisible glory and give it a presence. It took me a really long time to be able to disclose my disability to people who didn't already know about it. And it took longer still to actually be comfortable in disclosing it. I can do it now in college amongst my colleagues, but there are other aspects of my life where it can still be difficult, very difficult, in fact. And the reason for that is that I still worry, and I feel that there is often a navigation of other people's judgments and assumptions or preconceptions, and that sometimes navigating those are amongst the biggest barriers and the toughest to get over. Because we can understand our own boundaries and limitations, and we can work with those. But the external ones, the ones that are imposed, those are harder. In some ways, though, my academic journey, not specifically the PhD itself, but the actual overall journey, with all its ups and downs, has taught me to be a lot less bothered by assumptions. And I think that's been a good thing. John spoke in the last lecture about imposter syndrome. Everyone in academia has imposter syndrome, that worry that we're not good enough. But I think that when we're faced with assumptions, the very negative, the stifling aspects of imposter syndrome can become even more reinforced. And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. Another reason that I've been so blunt in this title is because I don't know very many people with Addison's or Barter's. Actually, I don't think I know anybody else at all who has Barter's. But there's a part of me that wants to give a voice and a presence to invisible disability in any of its forms, in the hopes that it might resonate with somebody else or help somebody else feel part of a network. Because invisible disability takes so many different forms and it has so many different root causes. But we're never alone. There are others on a similar journey who are happy to share and support. And it's important to remember that too, because invisible might not be easily identifiable, but invisible still exists in multiples. The final reason why my title is what it is because the journey between my two diagnoses, Addison's and Barter's, and the PhD journey itself are oddly linked, both in time, but also in my own changing attitudes to both. I was diagnosed with Addison's just as I was beginning my postgraduate studies. Actually, the diagnosis came in the same week that I started my PhD. I was diagnosed with Barter's almost exactly 6 years later, just weeks before I was awarded the PhD. And it might sound strange to say, but I see both of these diagnoses as a positive, because being undiagnosed and not knowing what was wrong, that was so much harder. And in that sense, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my college and undergraduate years before diagnosis, just to explain a little bit more about how PhD work became possible for me and how my outlooks changed. A diagnosis of a chronic medical condition, in one sense, can be seen as a boundary. But in another sense, once you know those boundaries, you can begin to work around, over, and through them. And for me, recognizing that I had boundaries and understanding what those boundaries were, that was key. It gave me a means to reset the compass, and resetting the compass is something I constantly have to do. My undergraduate degree was in architecture, and it was tough. It's a tough course anyway, with a very heavy workload. But for me, I was getting more and more unwell with each year that passed. And the increasing unwellness was masked by the toughness of the course and by the reputation of toughness that the course had. I was tired all the time. I fell asleep at parties. On one occasion, I even fell asleep sitting in front of a set of massive stereo speakers, speakers that were about the height of an under-counter fridge. There was a constant exhaustion that no amount of loud 80s music or a solid thumping bass could ever pierce. I thought it was the heavy workload, and I put myself under more and more pressure to get things done. But in addition to the crushing fatigue, I would also get chest infections 2 or 3 times a year. Chest infections that lasted not for days, but for months. In my 3rd year of college, I sat my exams in another university, a university that was located in my hometown because I was too unwell to make it from my flat in Dublin to the exam hall in the RDS. My dad drove me to the door and half carried me up the stairs to my exams that year. Just getting to the desk to sit the exams was a marathon effort. I postponed my studio work that year and did it from my parents' house over the summer. It was easier working from home. I didn't have to go in and out of college and use up all of my energy on the journey. As far as invisible disabilities go, mine had a manifestation, but it didn't have a name. 4th and 5th year of my undergraduate course weren't any better. I was just about getting through each day. I hated the fact that assessment was based on constant project work, because every time I got sick, I was knocked back, and there was no time to catch up before the next project started. With every single flare-up, my end of year grade was being eaten away, and I resented that so much, but I couldn't do anything about it, other than work longer hours and become even more unwell, which I did. I didn't realize that there was something bigger going on. I thought that I was just exhausted and had to try harder. I made it through 5th year. I finished my degree, and then Addison's hit in full Technicolor glory. And by this stage, I wasn't just tired. I could barely walk across the room, and I got motion sickness from people walking past me. My muscles just stopped working. At night, I would dream that I was dancing and running, but when I was awake, I could hardly move, and breathing took so much effort. I was on a nebulizer 4 times a day and losing weight so rapidly that doctors thought I had anorexia. I was too unwell to practice as an architect after working so hard to get the degree. But there was still no name for what was wrong, which made for great fun in applying for disability allowance or even trying to explain why I was in the situation that I was in. I had always wanted to do a PhD, and I knew the topic that I wanted to do it on. Architecture had always made most sense to me through sound, through music. Acoustics and sensory design were how I understood spaces. And that had been the subject of both my design thesis and my undergraduate research thesis. And while my health was deteriorating, I was reading a book on acoustics, and I kept reading it. I managed about 1 page a day, but it was enough to give me purpose. And that book kept me going while my health went downhill to the point where I was in a wheelchair that I couldn't propel myself because I wasn't strong enough. But at least other people could use it to help get me from A to B. And other people are amazing and so important. My parents encouraged me to apply for a PhD because they knew I had always wanted to do one. But they didn't tell me at that point that they didn't think I'd make it through to the other end. They just knew that it was what I wanted to do, what I had always wanted to do, and that it was giving me purpose. So they supported me and they encouraged me. And I did make it through to the other end. And I'm here now, 10 years later, still muddling through postdocs and fellowships and lecturing. And it does get easier because once you start, you can find a way to keep going, one step at a time. And I am eternally grateful that my parents didn't tell me that they didn't think I'd make it through, because then I might not have tried. So, the PhD. I was diagnosed with Addison's on the 6th of September, and I started my PhD on the 9th. Addison's is when your body doesn't make its own cortisol. There are a lot of magazine articles about cortisol, the stress hormone. But cortisol is a lot more than that. Every single one of our organs needs cortisol to function. If the body doesn't have enough cortisol, organs stop working. And that's called an Addisonian crisis. And cortisol needs fluctuate under certain conditions. Cortisol needs increase if there is infection, a bad fall, or broken bones, physical trauma, shock. All of these things require an adjustment. So living with Addison's is being in a world where you have to preempt what the body needs on a structured daily basis, and also act quickly in replacing cortisol in bigger doses if something unexpected happens. And let's face it, the unexpected happens probably as often as the expected. At least in my world it does anyway. By the time I was diagnosed with Addison's, I had developed blood clots in both of my lungs from hypovolemia. I was in my 20s, but my physiotherapists had to use the assessment scale that they use for people who are in their 90s. The first year of my PhD, I was recovering from having been unwell for so long. And in the beginning, I managed about an hour's work a day while my body built itself up again. And while I learned to expect the unexpected and manage fluctuating cortisol replacement. An hour a day might not sound like very much, but it was a big improvement on a page a day. And it was everything that I had to give at that point. My PhD was an interdisciplinary one. It was about architecture, music, and acoustics. And it involved fieldwork as well as archive work. And hopefully I can speak a little to both of those facets of a research journey here too. For the first few months of my PhD, I went to college each day with what my friends and I referred to as the Bentley and the Jaguar. I don't actually have a collection of really fancy cars. In fact, I don't even drive. And if I did, I would most definitely drive a DeLorean, complete with a time machine. And that would be the archive work sorted. But I don't have a DeLorean either, or a time machine. And the Bentley and the Jaguar were in fact a wheelchair and a walker. The walker was Jaguar Racing Green, hence its name. I didn't go to college on the days when I had physio or clinics, because there's only so much that one body can handle in a given day. And that was something that I had to learn to accept. By the end of year one, I'd worked up from a page a day to a book a day and developed a purposeful habit of leaving my desk really messy. I mean, really messy, with everything I was working on left open. So that if a medical condition flared up and I couldn't get straight back to what I was working on, there was a reminder of exactly where I had left off, even though it probably looked horrendous to anybody walking past. I also had to drop the architect's habit of working with really trendy hardback notebooks with good heavyweight paper, because good heavyweight paper is heavy. And my college bag already had a portable nebulizer and daily, as well as emergency meds in it. Post-it notes were much better, and I had a lot of them everywhere. In fact, some of the core ideas of my thesis began life on Post-it notes, and I'm still addicted to them today. Even with a diagnosis of Addison's, though, things still weren't right, and my abilities fluctuated a lot from day to day. My manual dexterity and fine motor skills went downhill, and my muscles were acting strangely. Sometimes an entire side of my body would go numb and floppy, and my body wasn't tolerating the usual Addison's regime of steroid dosing in 2 or 3 chunks per day. Towards the end of my PhD, I was working on acoustic data. In fact, I was drawing graphs of data, specifically reverberation curves, and looking at patterns in how different acoustic parameters interacted. I decided to try the same with analyzing my steroid replacement throughout the day. Cortisol replacement is supposed to fit a curve too. And I knew from my blood test results that my cortisol replacement was in a very broad category of what was considered normal. As a curve, a drawing, I would describe it as clumsy or fragmented. So I sketched an overlay of what a more refined daily curve would look like, and made an estimate of how much cortisol and when would cause the peaks and troughs necessary to create that curve. And then I sketched that into. Now I have to be really clear here. This was not scientific. There were no maths behind this and no medical expertise either. It was a sketch, a drawing, It was based on knowing how my body works and how it responds to cortisol. And it was also based on the fact that I like to draw and describe things in order to understand them myself. So I took the drawing and talked it through with my endocrinologist. He was happy for me to try smaller, more frequent doses of steroid to replace my cortisol. And I found a cortisol regime that worked for me. After that, I still had unexplained muscular symptoms, but Addison's was under good control. Except for one very strange thing. With Addison's, potassium is usually high. And in my labs, it was coming back as low. Towards the end of PhD, I finally managed to get a blood test during one of the episodes of muscle weakness, and my potassium came back as 2.1. Apparently, 2.1 is a potassium level that would knock a horse. I'm not a horse, so I can't say. But for a human, it feels pretty horrible. At that level, I can't support my head on my neck. I slur my words. I have seizures, and breathing takes huge effort. The only good thing about 2.1 is that it is a number, and numbers are data, and data are clues. Going forward from these clues, a few more tests determined that in addition to Addison's, I also have Barter's. Barter's is a defect in the kidneys that causes potassium wasting. Lots of things exacerbate the potassium issue, including swings in cortisol and insulin. So managing Barter's with Addison's and reactive hypoglycemia is a delicate balancing act. But you know what? Research is a balancing act too. Every step in the research journey, every finding prompts you to react, to look at things through a different lens, to think differently, to size things up. And that is the first piece of advice that I would give anyone thinking of doing a PhD. Be prepared to reset the compass, both in terms of your research and in terms of yourself. And know that sometimes resetting the compass pushes you in a better and stronger direction, even if it doesn't seem like it at the time. There are logistical and physical obstacles, but there are usually ways around them or ways to push around them and find something better if you really feel like getting your own back on obstacles. And in this, I think that mentorship and people play such a strong role. The biggest solutions and supports in my journey were people. People are amazing. People got me through my PhD, and they did so in so many different ways. Many of those people don't even realize how big an impact they had or how much I appreciate having them in my life. At an intellectual level, bouncing ideas off people brings those ideas into the world and makes you think. At a fundamental human level, people supported me and listened to me and believed in me. And that meant that I could believe in myself, because support takes many different forms. There are people who have walked through fire with me and for me. Because of them, I never had to disclose my disability in front of strangers if I didn't want to. If they saw me flagging in front of other people and knew what was coming, they would announce that it was time for a coffee break or lunch. So nobody had to know that I wasn't feeling well. This was really big for me because it let me keep my agency. It let me make my own decisions. When things were really tough, the same people let me cry and laugh or cry and laugh all at the same time. They made sure that seminars and work happened in rooms that I could get into. They made sure that I had transport to places I needed to be. This wasn't official college policy or something any of them had to do. This was just people being amazing, and I can't say it enough. And if I can pay that kindness and support forward to other students, it would make me very happy and proud. Another piece of advice that is important, but I'll be perfectly honest, it is difficult to follow, is own your own limits and only own your limits. And this is the bit about imposter syndrome. Don't take on negative preconceptions from anyone or anywhere else about what you can or cannot do. As I have said already, I'm eternally grateful that my parents didn't tell me that they didn't think I'd be physically able to make it through my PhD. If they had, I might never have started. I'm also eternally grateful to have done my PhD alongside people who saw the solutions and not the limitations in everything, and who shared that outlook. If I hadn't had this, I would have started my PhD with fundamental doubts, and those doubts would have become new barriers and new limits. And I already have enough barriers and limits of my own. And my limits, well, I might not be too thrilled about them, but they are mine. And I've worked really hard to understand them, to work with them, to work through them, to work around them. So own your own limits and work with them. And don't accept the imposition of anybody else's preconception-y limits. Okay, so preconception-y isn't really a word, but don't accept being told you can't or you're not able, because those are imposed limits and they're not yours. You don't have to own them. Put it this way. I trained as an architect originally, and I like to visualize things. I like to draw, and you've probably already gathered that. If my own limits are lines on a page, it would be really nice if that page was a modernist masterpiece with about 3 lines on it to sculpt the space, but it isn't. I have a few more lines to work around than that. My page is probably more ornamental, Victorian maybe, or Baroque. And there's no more room on that page for any preconception-y limits that don't need to be there. It's hard to keep that page clear of additional lines though, and that is imposter syndrome. There have been plenty of situations where life was hard, or I felt that I wasn't capable, or I was made to feel that I wasn't capable. And those are the times that I fell at the hurdle. And then my page couldn't even be described as ornamental or Baroque, just a muddled mess of lines and limits that didn't need to be there. I'm not saying that it's easy to filter out negative preconceptions. It isn't. I still haven't learned how. But you can always avoid or reinforce instead. Avoid means working more with mentors and supportive people. As for reinforcing, I take the same approach to academic work in general. If you get turned down for one fellowship or rejected for one paper, reapply to another one. Why not a bigger one? And then you stop seeing it as a judgment on you and more as a piece of the journey, a resetting of the compass. A little bit of dealing with that is to do with realism and pragmatism. And I'll be honest here, I handle pragmatism the way I handle cortisol replacement. And that is in small divided doses as required. If my brother was here, he'd do his not very flattering impression of me avoiding pragmatism. but he's at the other side of the Atlantic and it's ridiculous o'clock in the morning where he is, so you'll be spared that. But in terms of being realistic, yes, I have to be realistic about how my days go. I have to set an alarm for 6 a.m. so that my steroids and potassium have time to kick in before starting the day. I have to be realistic and pragmatic about balancing steroids against potassium, and absolutely rigorous in ensuring that I take them at the right times throughout the day. I have to be sensible about eating and sleeping and not messing with my blood sugar, and about respecting my limits so that those limits can function as more of a signpost than a full stop. And you have to be rigorous in research with data, with footnotes, with references. But again, these are things that require rigor or pragmatism. They are structural. When it comes to ideas, aspirations, dreams, that's a different story. The structural things support those. When it comes to dreams and aspirations, the best piece of advice that I can give anyone is to have them and not allow them to be diminished. Dream big and work through any issues step by step as they come up. You'll get there. A PhD happens in bits and pieces. It changes pace and it changes rhythm. Inspiration and productivity don't necessarily happen at a desk under perfect circumstances. So don't worry if your work method or your workday don't fit an ideal picture or an idealized pattern. Inspiration strikes everybody in the most mundane circumstances. I can look at book chapters and fellowship applications and think, oh, I wrote that one in the Matter. I wrote those two in the Bonds. If I lived on the South Side, I'd probably have written a few from Vincent's. But the point is that things happen when they happen. Other chapters came about when I was cleaning the fridge or doing the ironing. Very few came from sitting at an ordered desk with perfectly sharpened pencils. And anyway, as you know, I don't have an ordered desk, and I donated my pencil sharpener to my 10-year-old. The final thing I want to talk about is fieldwork. So when it comes to fieldwork, I would say plan it like a military operation. Be rigorous about what your body needs and factor in rest. Factor it in before you go and before you get swept up in the work. I didn't always do this. And when I didn't have a full diagnosis or fully understand what was wrong, it wasn't always possible to do this anyway. But that is not an excuse for this last story that I'm about to tell you. I'm going to tell this story, and you'll be able to see quite clearly what I did wrong. In retrospect, even I can see it. But I'll begin. The thing with building acoustics is that you do the site work at night, when it's quiet and less likely that there will be any noise to compromise recordings or measurements. And this makes a lot of sense. The thing with archive work is that you do it during the day when the archives are open. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Anyway, during my PhD, the opportunity came to access a really amazing building and also to access its archives. This was really exciting because the building was the crux of my whole thesis. I put in a funding application to cover the costs of fieldwork, and it was granted to cover about 3 days. And this was going to be some of the more significant work of my PhD. So with the help of my superbly amazing colleagues and collaborators, we loaded up a van with acoustic equipment and set off for a site which shall remain nameless. It was an intense few days of work. I managed to keep Addison's relatively well under control. But by night 3, Barter's, which hadn't yet been identified, was taking the brunt of the additional compensation for Addison's. Potassium wasting kidney diseases do not like being subjected to extra cortisol. They tend to get into a bit of a grump and go into overdrive. I didn't know I had a potassium wasting kidney disease. I just knew that sometimes one side of my body would temporarily stop working. Now, I'm telling this story assuming that there is a statute of limitations on health and safety, but in case there isn't, I'll be a little bit circumspect. There is a type of building that may or may not have been the focus of case studies during my PhD. This type of building may or may not occasionally be medieval in origin. It may or may not have a difficult to access loft area that may or may not involve spiral staircases or ladders or ancient and uneven steps. These are very beautiful. And from an acoustic point of view, those hypothetical loft areas usually sound amazing. And one of the cool things about acoustics is that you can take measurements to tell what music would sound like when it is performed in different parts of a building or when it is listened to in different parts of a building. You just have to be able to get microphones and speakers to those areas, even if they're difficult to access. Now, one way to do this might be to duct tape your very expensive microphones to a long stretch of WAVN pipe and sort of wave it into position from the ground several meters below. Not that I would ever have done this with very expensive microphones. Another way to do it is to get yourself up there and bring the equipment with you. This is fine if you are fully mobile. It is less fine if you get all the way up there and the temporary paralysis that comes with barters kicks in and one side of your body stops working. That would be leg, arm, neck with head slumped onto shoulders. Well, I didn't then know what barters was. I had realized that this only happened when salt and potassium, my electrolyte levels, were out of whack. Now, up until today, and I say today because you're all about to know, but up until today, there were only 2 other people in the world who knew that this incident may or may not have happened in a difficult to access loft in a very ancient building, maybe. Anyway, those 2 people are both absolute legends and my very dear friends who also have the patience of saints and the problem-solving abilities of your average Nobel Prize winner. I am very fortunate in my friends. One of them was with me. The other was frantically searching for 7-Up, Dioralyte, and snacks with the appropriate nutrients to try to rebalance my electrolytes. And when she found them, she wasn't allowed into the building, so she posted them through the letterbox of this building that may or may not have been medieval in origin. And my other wonderful friend collected them and delivered them to me. So it took about an hour for my limbs to reach the point where I could get down that possibly ancient staircase. And I'm not sure what my friend's blood pressure was like at that point, but he never ever complained. And they both still put up with me, thankfully. And because of these amazing people, there is really wonderful data that elucidated a complete acoustical and musical mystery, and that I'm still using now, more than 10 years later in my work. Just to conclude, I'm not using slides in this presentation, but there is one image that I'd like to describe. This is Fred. Fred is a binaural head, which is a type of microphone that records from within the ears of a dummy head. The point of Fred, from the perspective of architectural acoustics, is that recordings represent the differences in what is heard between the left and the right ears. So data from Fred gives a much truer sense of the impact of walls on shaping an aural environment. And this type of data is great for somebody who works in architectural acoustics. So Fred is supported by an adjustable tripod so that he can gather data that represents different heights as well. And in this image, Fred, in silhouette, is as tall as his tripod can make him, looking down from an unexplained height in an unidentified building that may or may not be medieval in origin. Fred gathers brilliant data. He's an acoustic wonder. Unfortunately, Fred does not have barters. So he didn't ever get stuck up there in that medieval building for 45 minutes to an hour, waiting for his electrolytes to rebalance. Thank you for listening.
Wow, Fiona, that was really, I mean, something, such an honest and open account of your journey. And just thinking from my own perspective, from a selfish perspective, I suppose, that there's so much that resonates with me. I used the word resonate there. I hope you appreciate that.
Brilliant choice of words.
Yes, indeed. So I did learn something today, as you can see. And I think so many else did too. And I could see that in the chat today, that people really, you know, could link in and empathize with so much that you said today. And there is really so much to process there. And I really particularly took an awful lot from some of your points. I loved your Bentley and your Jaguar. And I think that from my own perspective, that I often have not quite so fancy names on some of my equipment.
Do you have a DeLorean?
No, I don't. And I think I need to branch out a little bit in terms of that. But I think it was really, really important. And some of the points that you made, you know, about the importance of thinking differently. I really like that. And I think that is something that I think the universities and the world of academia and the wider world needs to appreciate about disabled people, that we have to think differently in so much of what we do. And so the result is that we can bring something different to the table. And it's sad that that difference is being lost by the fact that there are so many disabled people who are not fully engaged in postgraduate study or academia. And of course, we can look at the wider world as well in terms of that. And so that is one of the major contributions that we can bring to this sector. And I'd love to see that happen a little bit more. I thought people are amazing and believe in me. And I really, having graduated only 2 weeks ago from my in-person, I waited for my in-person graduation, and I had the opportunity, of course, to bring my family. And that was one of the reasons why I waited for the in-person, so I could bring those people along that believed in me. The people that people who never suggested that I wouldn't be able to complete my PhD.
It's so important, isn't it?
It is
huge. You cannot emphasize enough how important it is, because it affects your whole outlook, yourself, and your own self-belief.
Yeah, no, and that is absolutely correct, Fiona. And that really connected with me as well. And I'm just going to mention two or three more points in terms of because I know there are a few questions, and that owning your own limits. And I know this is something that I see Sarah nodding her head immediately. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about how you did that, because that is something I am currently, right at this very minute, struggling with. And I'm wondering how you managed it.
That is a very deep question.
Okay, well,
we're here for a while.
Okay. So if there were, but there are sure, knowing you, Fiona, I'm sure you had there, and seeing how organized you are in your thoughts and your delivery today. Even though you claim to have a disorganized desk, I really don't believe it. But I'm just wondering then, surely that there are kind of some kind of markers that you use, are kind of not red lines, but nearly a light system that you use to say, well, actually, you know what? I've reached my limit now, or I haven't reached my limit, or I'm nearly at my limit.
Oddly enough, it was lockdown that really brought me to the point where I could read those limits properly. And it was because there wasn't that pressure to go everywhere and be everywhere and do everything. And the guilt associated with not doing it was not there. So I could see myself much more clearly. I could see, with that pressure removed, I could see the points where I need to stop. And I could accept the fact that sometimes I have to write propped up by pillows with a duvet. But you know what? Half the world's doing that too.
Yeah.
It's just that it's okay now. And that pressure, that sense that if I don't do this, people will think I can't, that's gone because nobody could see it. And then I began to understand and really see that, okay, I'm at a point now where I can't keep going today. So that's it. Or I'm at a point where, yes, I can work, but I have to work with pillows. And that's it. And it just gave that bit of clarity, taking away that extra negativity, I suppose, negative pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true, actually. And it's funny, I was doing some research recently, and that was one of the aspects that came true. It was other disabled people were saying that the uh, the the views around being out sick, people's views about you being out sick, their level of empathy has increased, or seemed to increase, and also level of understanding, if you're out sick, has seemed to have increased. So I think, yeah, the lockdown. I'm going to move over to Sarah now, because I know there are other questions and I don't want to hog all that space. Sarah, maybe you'd give us some idea.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Awesome. Fiona, that was just brilliant. And like Viv said, I also have a couple points that resonated so much with me too, but I'll stick with the questions for the moment. First, we have a couple in there. So Joe asked, did you disclose your disabilities to the university when doing your PhD? I didn't for the first 18 months. Once I did, I got an ILP and moved to part-time. It feels more supported and achievable now. So I don't know if you want to talk about when you disclosed those disabilities or what you did with that.
When I started my PhD, I was in a wheelchair, so it was obvious. There was no way I could hide it. When it came to working, as I moved to being a bit more mobile and it came to working with external people, I didn't disclose it. I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want to be prejudged. I didn't want anything. I didn't. And when I started my postdoc in another university, I didn't disclose it either. I was afraid. And it took until I went into an Addisonian crisis during my postdoc and ended up in hospital, and I couldn't hide that because I was out for 2 weeks, that I kind of said, okay, well, I have Addison's and I have Barter's, and my department were just like, perfect, you're you. We're really glad you're here. And it was no big deal. But it took, that was 6 or 8 years on from starting my PhD, and that was somewhere else, that was somewhere anonymous where I felt I could do it. It took a long time to be able to do it.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question is, did you discuss how your chronic illnesses impacted your fieldwork in the methodology of your PhD? I'm a first-year PhD student with multiple disabilities and chronic illnesses. I'm researching deaf lesbians, where and how they create spaces, and an obvious methodology is observations. I'm, however, not sure if my body can handle this methodology, and I'm looking for literature about tailoring your methodology to your own needs and capabilities, but it's almost impossible to find any information.
That is such an interesting PhD. Wow. I don't know that I can guide you in terms of literature, but I can guide you in terms of experience. And my experience was that my disability and my chronic illnesses and how they shaped a lot of how I think. I think they made me interdisciplinary, whereas I would have been an entirely different scholar otherwise. They became part of my methodology because I had to think differently, because I couldn't do a lot of the physical work. I had to introduce a much stronger theoretical component. And then I began to weave the theoretical component into the fieldwork in a different way. And it gave me a different perspective. It gave me a different methodology. It gave me the skills that I have now. And it shaped the scholar that I am now. I'd be very different if I hadn't had to deal with this, and if I hadn't had to integrate different ways of thinking. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, because I don't have a body of literature to cite, but it's about you. And it's always about you. Your research is you. It's part of your identity. And you do a PhD for so long, it does become part of your identity. And I think never be afraid to write yourself into your work.
Absolutely. Joe also came back and said lockdown was a turning point for them as well. I disclosed my conditions to the university, and during this time, it has been a relief, to be honest. I was also diagnosed with 2 other conditions during this time. Accepting that these gave me limits has been a turning point for me. So I think that's echoing kind of your points as well there. I think those are the end of the questions. John has a comment for the interpreters. He's a bit mortified seeing 1 ISL interpreter against 2 BSL interpreters, but special thanks to Lisa.
Well,
But
so I'm just conscious that we're coming up to 2 o'clock now, and I know a lot of people will be moving towards going back to work or going back to their desk. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank Fiona for coming in, Dr. Fiona Smith, for coming in to speak today about her journey, her PhD journey as part of our series, Breaking Boundaries series. Our next talk will take place on the 17th of May between 1 and 2 p.m. And we will have Dr. Rosaline McDonough coming in on the 17th of May to discuss intersectionality and different identities. So we're really looking forward to it. And that, unfortunately, will be our final talk and part of our series. And during that series, the aim has really been to raise awareness of the need for institutions to ensure that they are working to make postgraduate study a viable option for disabled people, both obviously within the college system, but also those considering returning to education. So until our next seminar, I wish you all a lovely spring, and that I will see you in the summer, which will be May. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Okay, Fiona, thank you.
Thank you, Viv. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you for having me here to talk. It was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.